Hey everyone, what's up? Today I've got a special project I'm really excited about. You probably heard of Minisforum as a manufacturer of popular mini PCs, and I've wanted to test one of these for some time, but when they reached out to me offering to test one of their motherboards with an integrated mobile Ryzen CPU instead, I was like, well, you know what? Let's do this. So here we are, building a micro ITX PC, in this case using the Minisforum BD795M micro ITX motherboard, including the Ryzen 9 7945HX. Full disclosure, Minisforum did send over the motherboard, but they didn't pay for the review or saw the video before it was published. And while you could also use a regular ATX case to build around it, I wanted to go for a more stylish approach using the Deepcool CH370 in white, which is a relatively cheap but stylish micro ITX case with some nice cheese grade optic for around only 50 euros or dollars. And right now, euros and dollars are almost traded 1-to-1 if you're not considering spending power of each country, so I'm gonna use the euro prices for this video only. As the Minisforum BD795M comes with a quite powerful soldered mobile CPU, the AMD Ryzen 9 7945HX with 16 cores and 32 threads, I thought I'm going to make this a smaller budget 3D rendering workstation by combining it with a used RTX 3070 from eBay for 220 euros, which is probably the cheapest way to get a GPU with 12 GB of RAM in Germany, which will come in handy for 3D applications like Blender. Furthermore, we're gonna install 32 GB of DDR5 5600 MHz RAM by Crucial, while the board only supports up to 5200 MHz or megatransfers, but it was cheaper that way with 80 euros. And I didn't want to lose speed by using 4800 MHz RAM instead. I'm also installing a 1TB M.2 PCIe Express 4 SSD by Western Digital for the drive, which did cost me 55 euros. And since this is a mobile CPU, I went for a cheaper budget air cooling solution by Endorfy for only 36 euro, including an RGB fan. The Endorfy Fera 5 aRGB tower cooler. And we'll see if that's good enough to cool down the Ryzen 9, since it's in theory specified for up to 220 watt, whereas the 7945HX should max out at around 120 to 130 watt in the worst case scenario. Now, this board doesn't have an RGB header, but there should be some basic controller included with the cooler for some basic RGB stuff. I also ordered a 120mm white case fan by Be Quiet for around 10 euros to replace the black one here at the back, and I'm gonna move this one to the front of the case. And since this is a micro ITX case, I actually went for a regular but modular PSU to be more flexible with cable management, the Be Quiet System Power 9 CM 600 watt for 70 euros. Adding up the whole budget, including the $439 for the main board with the CPU, that makes a total of around 965 euros and should probably be quite similar in dollars for the US market. Also mind that everything except for the GPU is brand new. But now, without further ado, I'm gonna do my very best putting all of this together so I can properly test this motherboard CPU combo. So let's go.
This is Hubwood.
Sorry, I think I just mixed up ATX and RTX in the previous section. However, as you can see, it worked. The system is up and running just fine, and I have to point out the Deepcool CH370 is a fun case to build in despite the very thin black metal it has. And RGB is working just fine, and I've connected the included RGB adapter to the reset button, which now lets me choose colors and animation modes. That's pretty lit. But before we talk about how everything performed, or the CPU, the BIOS, benchmarks and gaming, let's first talk about the detailed specs and the connections the Minisforum BD795M motherboard CPU combo offers. Okay, so as mentioned before, we get that mighty 16-core 32-thread mobile version of the Ryzen 9 7945HX, which by default runs with around 102 watt on this board on the load, and a very short boost time with up to 120 watt. It can boost up to 5.4 GHz on one core, and depending on wattage, temperature and use case, the all-core turbo is around 4.3 to 4.4 GHz. The integrated GPU in this processor is the Radeon 610M, not fast enough for most newer modern games out there. Then we're getting 2 slots for DDR5 SO-DIMM laptop RAM, a fully fledged PCI Express 4.0 by 16 slot for a GPU, but if you don't need a graphics card, you could of course put in something else. 2 M.2 PCI Express 4 slots, which are placed at the front of the main board near the GPU. One is above and one below the GPU slot. We are also getting 2 SATA slots and a small M.2 slot for PCI Express Wi-Fi/Bluetooth cards, while there are 2 antennas included in the box for that card. There are 3 connectors for system fans, 1 at the top and 2 at the bottom, as well as a connector for the CPU fan and a water pump for AIOs. And front panel headers for audio, USB 2 and USB 3. Again, unfortunately, no USB-C. So Minisforum kinda made a funny choice for the CPU cooler mounting system, as you'll need to use the Intel LGA 1700 adapter for the mounting brackets, despite this being an AMD CPU. I guess they chose that because of the board layout or whatever. But that's not a problem, as most CPU fans include mounting options for that socket, and mounting the cooler was no problem. At first I was a little worried about the big area of the CPU surface that probably most coolers wouldn't cover, but spoiler, that doesn't matter. The important part is that T-shaped copper area in the middle. Connection-wise, at the back we're not getting that many options, to be honest. An HDMI 2.1 and a DisplayPort 1.4 port. 2 USB 3.2 and 2 USB 2.0 Type A ports. A 2.5 gigabit LAN port and 3 ports for audio in, audio out and a microphone. So only 4 USB ports without the front panel. In the case of my build, that's a total of 6 USB ports, while none of them reached more than 5 gigabit per second transfer speed, so we won't get more than 500 megabytes per second for external drives. And again, there is no option for a USB-C port, neither at the back nor the front of the panel, which I'm really missing here. So we'll definitely need an adapter for that. Now the BIOS really surprised me with all the options it offers. We can basically take full control over the CPU, including overclocking, undervolting, curve optimizing and such, and even configure RAM speeds and timings. Also, some basic fan speed tuning is possible, while I would have preferred a variant with a temperature curve for more precision. The default temperature of the CPU fan to run at full speed is set to 94 degrees Celsius, by the way. And that is still an okay temperature for the CPU. It won't throttle before it reaches 95 degrees. Now my viewers who are familiar with mobile CPUs know that, but it might be irritating or frightening for some desktop users. However, I never reached 94 degrees Celsius for the CPU anyways, even under maximum load, while testing it in a room at around 21 degrees Celsius. PS, there is no official Windows software from Minisforum to control the fans just yet, but definitely more options in the BIOS than on most laptops. Though you actually can control the CPU fan and the system fans via the free software Fan Control, and that worked really well for the CPU fan and the Be Quiet fan on the back, while the Deepcool case's pre-installed Deepcool fan was not addressable. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the task manager. This is currently set to German, but I'm pretty sure most of you could navigate through this, even if it was set to Chinese or Greek. So Here's the Ryzen 9 7945HX with its 16 cores and 32 threads that can boost up to 5.4 GHz and around 4.2 to 4.4 GHz for the all-core turbo if you're not tweaking it. And here we have our 32 GB of RAM with 5200 megatransfers working perfectly fine. And by the way, this supports up to a massive 96 GB of total RAM. And let's quickly run Cinebench R23 to show you the temperatures, which stay pretty cool in Cinebench R23, especially in a single run. And also take a look at how fast the 32 threads just rush through that benchmark run in real time for a super high total of 32,970 points for the multi-core score, while the single-core score is around 1,950 to 1,960 points. And while we're at it, let's have a look at some more benchmarks. In Geekbench, it scored 2,856 for the single-core score and 16,352 for the multi-core score. For PC Mark X, it scored an insanely high 8,287 with the RTX 3060 installed, which I didn't expect, to be honest. And oh, by the way, it boots up into a ready Windows within just 19 seconds. And in the budget system benchmark for Adobe Premiere, it scored a very high 9,877, which was by far one of the high scores I could find for a system with an RTX 3060, surely due to the 32 threads of the mighty Ryzen 9. And in the Blender benchmark run, it scored around 465 points for the CPU, again pretty high for a CPU, and around 2,215 for the RTX 3060. And here an alternative budget card with 12 GB, the brand new Intel B580, is clearly behind NVIDIA due to NVIDIA's CUDA cores and better optimization for Blender in general. And I've tested some 3D Mark benchmarks as well. A total score of 21,444 for Firestrike, with a very high 41,656 for the physics test, which is focusing on the CPU only. And a total of 9,196 for TimeSpy with a CPU score of 13,687. And since we can even further optimize the CPU with the curve optimizer in the BIOS overclocking section, I also ran some tests with a curve optimizer of -10 and -20 on all cores. For Cinebench R23, that now resulted in 34,187 in the multi-core score test for -10 and even 34,618 for -20. Since that way, the CPU can be used more effectively without using more watt, meaning the clocks just go higher as before. And if you're combining that with giving it a bit less power to the CPU, you can easily achieve stock performance at lower wattages, resulting in lower temperatures and less power consumption and, well, quieter fans. Yay! But that's not all. I also actually underpowered the CPU to 55 watt for some tests, which is more or less laptop level, and that resulted in the same single core score of 1,960 for Cinebench and still pretty high 28,997 for the multi-core score. That's only 12% less multi-core performance, while it used 46% less power, leading to a much higher efficiency or points per watt. So as you can see, there is a lot of room for optimizing and customizing the CPU to your own liking on this board. I mean, sure, the Ryzen 9 7945HX is not exactly the mobile sibling of the desktop 7950X in every way, but it's pretty close performance-wise, and it's achieving that with a superb efficiency. Now, the speed of the SSD of course depends on the model you'll choose, but for the Western Digital Blue I got 3.5 GB per second for the reading and 3.8 GB per second for the writing speed with a pretty empty drive. Temperatures obviously depend on the used cooler, but here are the results for the rather cheap Endorfy Fera 5 that I've used. With the stock settings for the CPU and the fan curve, on idle the CPU temperature then was around 45 to 50 degrees Celsius at a room temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. 75 degrees Celsius after 10 minutes of Cinebench R23 with their fans still running pretty quiet with around 1450 RPM. And for gaming, I got around 85 to 90 degrees Celsius for the CPU while playing Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p with high settings, and it's quite surprising that the temperatures have actually been higher while gaming. And to be honest, I have no idea what was the cause for that. Okay, I actually just asked ChatGPT and it suggests it could be the fact that games use less cores but utilize them harder, which could lead to hotspots on a chip with so many cores. And yeah, Also, the heat from the GPU, which is then active, could additionally heat up the CPU. Okay, sounds reasonable. I also quickly want to mention the total system power that it drew from the wall. 40 watt on idle with the RTX 3060 installed, and 28 watt without a dedicated GPU. In Cinebench I saw 180 watts with and 162 watts without the GPU. And for gaming, the whole system was drawing a total of 320 watt, while the GPU uses a chunk of around 165 to 170 watt of the total power draw. I also actually tested working with Blender using one of the demo files with the Cycles engine and viewport denoising to show you that the system is really capable. Thanks to that, real-time rendering is basically possible here using optics for NVIDIA cards. The main reason why I preferred the 3060 over the 3070 or 4060 is A, the price, and most importantly B, the 12GB VRAM, which will help a lot rendering more complex scenes, especially when using optics, since otherwise smaller VRAM amounts are often causing renders to fail and you'll have to use CUDA instead, or in the worst case scenario even switch to the CPU to render the image, which is a lot slower, though in the case of the Ryzen 9 7945HX it's much faster than on almost any other consumer CPU. Pretty much comparable to what a GTX 1650 achieves here. The RTX 3060 is just the best budget card for Blender in my opinion. The next best option with 12GB would be a used RTX 4070. And of course I also tested some games on the system, while of course the gaming performance depends mostly on the used GPU. But with this CPU you could absolutely use an RTX 4090 or so. Before we start, I've slightly undervolted the GPU to 975 millivolts and simultaneously overclocked it by around 150 MHz for the core clock to 2010 MHz in total, and I also overclocked it by 1000 MHz for the memory clock. Cyberpunk 2077 ran with around 70 to 90 FPS at 1440p with high settings and DLSS set to quality. Really flat frame time graph and basically no stutters at all. As mentioned before, the temperatures are quite high, though since games don't usually utilize 16 cores for the CPU, the boost clock was very high with 5.3 to 5.4 GHz. Overall perfectly playable, a really good experience. I tested the new Microsoft Flight Simulator 24 with 1440p, medium settings and DLSS on quality with around 55 to 60 FPS flying over Manhattan. Pretty low CPU utilization here, and again very playable, basically no stuttering, mostly very good frame times. For CS2 I was actually using 1080p with low settings and FSR turned off to see what the system can really achieve here. That resulted in a very consistent 350 to 370 FPS in a deathmatch on Dust 2. Very smooth gameplay, and as we can see the RTX 3060 was way below 100% in this configuration. Definitely a decent result. And Forza Horizon 5 once more at 1440p, high settings plus MSAA, ran with high 130 to 170 FPS. In this case both the CPU and GPU power draw haven't been fully maxed out, and the Ryzen 9 7945HX was literally bored in that title. And the frame time graph was smooth as it gets. Holy moly, it doesn't get flatter than that without an FPS cap, like for real. In Germany we would call that smooth as a baby's bottom, and yes, we are weird people with weird idioms, so you're absolutely right. And even Hogwarts Legacy had a mostly flat frame time graph, which is not common on most systems. But the 32GB of RAM and the many cores as well as 1440p and high settings plus DLSS quality surely help in this game. Around 70 to 90 FPS, perfectly playable for a single player third-person game. And last but not least, The Last of Us ran pretty similar at 1440p with high settings, though DLSS on balance this time. Again, 70 to 90 FPS and a super flat frame time graph, meaning no stuttering whatsoever. If you're interested in testing the BD795M by Minisforum yourself, I will leave a link in the description. The performance is absolutely great, especially considering this being a mobile chip. You're really not losing much performance if you compare it with the Ryzen 9 7950X at 70 watt less, so definitely much more efficient compared to a desktop CPU motherboard combo, while probably being around $100 or euros cheaper. Plus additional savings for a potentially less powerful PSU and a less powerful CPU cooler. Though there is definitely room for improvement, especially considering additional PCI Express slots and a USB-C port, as well as a connector for a USB-C front header. And I mean, obviously the CPU is soldered, you will never be able to upgrade it, but I'm pretty sure this combo is going to last a while. And by the way, Minisforum also has two even smaller mini ITX versions of these motherboards. Of course, they are configured a bit differently, but with the same CPU. So check them out if you want to build a super small desktop PC in a mini ITX case. And that's all for today. If you've enjoyed the content, make sure to like and/or subscribe to the channel for more laptop, handheld, mini PC stuff and benchmarks. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.